Well, let's start with a prayer because we've got a lot to talk about, all right? So in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for this day. We thank you for the sunshine, and we thank you that the snow is melting. And we pray that it melts completely away before we get another storm. We ask that you send your Spirit upon this group this evening as we conclude the books of Moses. We ask that you help us to understand the lessons that the Israelites give us, that we might learn from them, that we might avoid the same mistakes, so that way we might be able to embrace you fully as your beloved people. So we dedicate this evening to Our Lady as we pray. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. All right. Well, so again, thank you so much for coming. This is the last lesson. The last lesson for the fall season. And then after Advent, we'll pick up where we left off. But if you open up to your charts, we're going to look at the brown period, which is desert wandering. So it's brown, it's kind of tannish because of the sand. That's how you can remember it, the sand. So that pretty much means after tonight, we will have looked at the first 4 time periods from the early world to the desert wanderings. So you can see it doesn't take too long of a time. It's much more narrow for the simple fact that it's only 40 years. All right, so that's what we're going to be looking at today. The agenda specifically, because I was able to arrange this class the way it is, I'm actually able to add a whole other hour really to what Jeff Cavins was able to do. In the first part, right now, we're going to talk about the desert wanderings from Mount Sinai to the plains of Moab. Take a break, especially for some of you who have just come back from the Holy Land. We're going to talk about Mount Nebo. It's going to be kind of interesting. So we'll take a coffee break, recharge your batteries. Again, I provided some leaded, high-tech coffee, there for some of you. And then so when we get back from the break, part 2, Moses' last will and testament. We're going to spend an hour looking at Deuteronomy. Now I want you to say a quick prayer for me, because this is a challenge. The whole book of Numbers in 45 minutes, and then the whole book of Deuteronomy in 45 minutes. So it is going to be a challenge, but we want to look at the main themes and get a perspective now, the big picture of what's happening. Essentially, not just desert wanderings, but now concluding the 5 books of Moses. All right, so you ready to go?
Yeah.
All right, you got energy? Because you're going to need it. Trust me, you're going to need it. So part 1. Desert wanderings from Mount Sinai to the plains of Moab. Time out. Does everybody have notes? All right, so if anyone doesn't have notes, if you need another Bible, there's another Bible over there. Okay. So, part 1, desert wanderings from Mount Sinai to the plains of Moab. Let's do a quick overview of the book of Numbers, and then we'll sort of narrow it down a little bit. So Numbers, it's kind of intimidating, right? Especially someone who's not mathematically inclined, who wants to open up to Numbers? Right? So you don't like Numbers, so you're not going to read the book of Numbers. But the book of Numbers is only so called because of only 2 censi, that take place. Chapters 1 through 4, really, especially chapter 1. There's a census of all the tribes of Israel as they leave Mount Sinai. That's the first generation, that generation who actually left Egypt. And then there's a second census in chapter 26 that we'll look at very, very briefly of the second generation. All right? That's really the only reason why it's called Numbers. I mean, the Hebrew is in the wilderness, so it's much more descriptive of the book, in the wilderness. Okay? So that's why it's called Numbers. That's what we're going to look at, the transition from the first generation to the second generation. Because the first generation, they never make it. I mean, the Bible tells us that, we were just talking about this at the beginning, 70 people, so Israel's family, so Israel, the 12 tribes and their families, there are only 70 of them when they went down to Egypt. 400 years later, they had multiplied to 600,000. And of those 600,000 people, only 2 made it to the Promised Land. We're going to see why. Only 2 made it. It was their children that actually went into the Promised Land. So, in any case. Now, let's look at a quick map here. Maps are always good, right? What we saw last time is this transition from the land of Goshen, so out of Egypt, crossing the Reed or the Red Sea, and then down to Mount Sinai. That's where we basically are going to start off right now. Mount Sinai, and then we're going to see today how they go up north, they come to Kadesh, come back down, and then come up here to the plains of Moab. So that's the mental map for you as we're studying, and I'll be making reference to this many, many times. I think 3 or 4 times, so you can see kind of what's happening here. All right? Does that help you to kind of have the mental map? I thought about it, if I were more high-tech, I would do like Google Maps and have it all animated and stuff, but since it's not the same thing, this is going to have to suffice. Now, what's interesting is that the book of Numbers, nearly a third of the book, from chapters 1 through 10, takes place right here at Mount Sinai. They never leave. They're there for a year. So nearly a third of all of Numbers takes place right there. And essentially, it's actually, if you look at the notes, let me just give you a quick overview according to the Roman numerals in the notes. Roman numeral 1, we're going to look at this 1 year at Mount Sinai before their departure. And then on page 2 of the notes, finally they leave Sinai and they start marching, and ultimately wandering in the desert. We'll see why they're wandering, okay? In the desert towards Moab. Roman numeral 3, they finally get to Moab. The new generation gets to Moab, and we're going to look at that. And then finally, number 4, starting all over again. So it kind of gives you a little perspective, all right? Because remember, my challenge is the whole book, but I don't want anyone to get lost. So, pay close attention to the notes. So right now we're going to start with Numbers 1 through 10 and looking at some of these things, doing a little bit of review. So when you open up to chapter 1, verse 1, it's the census. It's the first census. These are the people of Israel as they are right there at Mount Sinai. So when you read it, though, it's interesting. This first census does not include the tribe of Levi. Levi is not included because Levi has been set apart. We'll do a little bit more review about that in a second. But it's all the tribes, the 12 tribes except for Levi. If you counted Levi, it would be 13 tribes. Did you know that? Okay, so Levi is set apart because they're the priests. So where do we get the 12 tribes? Because we always talk about the 12 tribes of Israel, right? But if you count Levi, it's the 13 tribes of Israel. So where does this extra tribe come from? So right here on this slide, I have, the sons zooming in. Levi is left out, so you count all the way down from Reuben to Dan, Gad, Asher, Naphtali. It's Joseph's sons. Joseph divides his blessing among his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And then it goes to Benjamin. So those are the 12 tribes that actually take allotments. They have, an inheritance in the land when they get there. And Levi, the tribe of Levi is the tribe of the priests, so they're not included. So if anyone has ever been confused about that, this should hopefully explain it away. Okay? So let's talk about why Levi is left out. As I said, now they're the priests. You probably remember that from last time. The sin of worshiping the golden calf in Exodus 32. God just established this covenant with them. Everything's fine and dandy. It's this great, really, this liturgy. They have this liturgical worship, this communion with God. All right, they are His people, and God is, they're God, their Father. And then they sin. And then the Levites become new priests. Why did they become new priests? Because they were the ones who stood up when Moses called for help, called for leaders, and they were the ones who executed all of the leaders, the chiefs, who were guiding Israel into this idolatry. And it just wasn't idolatry, remember? It was sort of this cultic prostitution worship where they were doing, when they rose up to dance, that's an idiom, all right? They were doing some very bad stuff. And it was the Levites who were the only ones who got up and said, we'll take care of it. And when they did it, they essentially ordained themselves to the priesthood. Okay? Now, in these opening chapters 1 through 4, and it kind of actually goes on to 10, the Levites are given all kinds of instructions. They receive their liturgical duties to protect, to maintain, and to transport the tabernacle. That, Moses just received instructions for the tabernacle and all of its furnishings. Now they're the ones that are going to take care of all of that. So it's them, not the firstborn sons. Because remember, originally, every firstborn son of every family, of every tribe, would worship God. They would serve as priests Everybody would. But now after the golden calf, it was just the Levites for the reasons I just explained again. And Numbers discusses this right off the bat. When we're talking, it says, then take the Levites for me in place of the firstborn sons of Israel. Remember, so now all the tribes, they're laicized, they're defrocked, they're demoted. And that's a huge, huge deal for them. The other aspect of this whole golden calf incident that we ended up, that we talked about last time was the institution of new laws. So we got the new priesthood and the new laws. The first, even Galatians says, St. Paul says in Galatians, why do we have this law? And that's what Leviticus is. We'll talk more about that in a second. But why do we have this law? It was added for transgressions until the descendant, the heir, right, Jesus himself, the Messiah, would come to whom the promise had been made. Remember that before the golden calf, they only had 4 chapters. The 10 Commandments, a few explanations of the 10 Commandments. That was all they needed to have to worship God in holiness and truth. But now after the golden calf, they've got all kinds of laws added to them. And the second instance, St. Paul also says in Hebrews, when there is a change of priesthood, there is necessarily a change of the law. So you can see everything changes because of the golden calf. Remember I said before, the golden calf is to Israel what the forbidden fruit was to Adam. Okay? That's very important to remember. So that's for 1 year. All that, so it's kind of like you can see Numbers kind of fitting really well into place with what we just discussed last time. For 1 year they're at Mount Sinai right there, receiving all these new laws and directions in the context of this new Levitical priesthood and this new tabernacle and the new the new liturgy that only the Levites could celebrate. All these instructions are included in the last chapters of Exodus and all of Leviticus and a little bit of Deuteronomy, and here also Numbers 1 through 10. So I also on that point, not just to kick a dead horse, but simply because nobody loves Leviticus, I just want to give a quick explanation a little bit more about Leviticus. It means having to do with the Levites. It is the user's manual for the Levitical priests. That's what it's all about. Now, if you begin to open it, you see all kinds of laws that take place. What's the purpose of all these laws? It's to help Israel become holy. And so we see in chapter 11, verse 44, it kind of sums up the whole purpose of Leviticus. You must be holy, for I am holy. Remember we talked about the terms of the covenant. God says, I will bless you, I will be your God, you will be to me a holy people, a royal priestly people. All you got to do is live moral lives. All right? That's all you got to do, and they failed to do that. So then Leviticus calls that to mind. And it's not just in Leviticus. St. Peter actually quotes this. And he says to his audience, like obedient children, and that's the key word, obedient children, do not act in compliance with the desires of your former ignorance. But as he who called you is holy, be holy yourselves in every aspect of your conduct. For it is written, be holy because I am holy. So he quotes Leviticus right there. And that's the call of Christians. And I think it's really interesting. This was a great insight for me when I became Catholic, is what's called the universal call to holiness. Holiness isn't just restricted to priests, to religious, all right? The nuns and the monks, and even though they make great beer and all that kind of stuff, they deny themselves in so many ways. We're all called to holiness, all of us. And we can be holy if we just obey God and frequent the sacraments and love God and love our neighbor. It's the universal call to holiness. We can all do it. We're all called to do it. And this is the message of Leviticus. So all of these really kind of strange laws, the dietary laws, the ritual laws, the purification laws, all these things that take place in Leviticus, and as well as Numbers and Deuteronomy for that matter, they are to set Israel apart. They're to remind Israel that they are a holy nation and that they are not to act like all the other nations. Okay? They got to remember their vocation to be a royal priestly people. Okay? Does that make sense to you? I wish we had a lot more time to give some examples of that, but ultimately that's the bottom line. That's the raison d'être of Leviticus. You must be holy. Okay? So Numbers discusses all of this. If you kind of scan it really quickly, you can see from Leviticus chapter 1, moving to Leviticus 3. So Leviticus 1 is the census of Israel. I'm sorry, I'm not talking about Leviticus. I meant Numbers. Pardon me. Numbers 1 is the census. And then Numbers 3, it's the census of Aaron, the Levitical priest, all their duties, what they're supposed to do for the tabernacle. And it goes on to explain what all their duties are. And then finally in chapter 6, something interesting takes place. We have this Nazirite vow. Nazirite vow has nothing to do with Jesus of Nazareth, for example, the town Nazareth. They're unrelated. The Nazirite vow is available for all of the tribes who, although they cannot be priests, they can still consecrate themselves to God in a special way. A loose analogy would be like religious life, okay? They can consecrate themselves to God temporarily or for an extended amount of time. And there are just three vows that they have to take. You read right here in verse 3, you cannot have any wine or strong drink, which would exclude automatically most Catholics. Number 2, all right, you cannot shave your head. No razor shall touch your head. Got to grow your hair out long. Number 3, you cannot go a corpse, a dead body. All right? Because it makes you unclean. Because you've dedicated yourself to God, who is the source of all life. So don't go near a dead body. Now, you might think that's not a big deal, right? I don't like hanging out with corpses anyways. No problem. It's the strong wine that I'm going to have an issue with. No. When your relatives die, that's going to be an issue, right? So what it does is it separates you from your family even to consecrate you even more to God. So when we read about the Nazirite vow, who does this remind you of right away? Samson, right? Yeah. The superhero, the sort of super strong guy in the Old Testament. He's sort of like he's like the hero, right? But like Superman, what's his kryptonite? He can't cut his hair. I just really want to quickly explain something because it seems like his kryptonite is his hair. But what we see when we look at Samson, we'll look at this when we get back after the Christmas season, after Advent, we're going to see that what Samson actually does is he breaks all 3 of these vows in succession. First, he kills a lion, and then he comes back later and he finds that some bees have created, in the corpse of the lion, some nice delicious honey. So he basically desecrates himself by sticking his hand into the lion's corpse, eating the honey, and he also gives this honey to his parents, which is a naughty thing to do as well, without telling them where it came from. All right, he's got this great riddle. So he breaks that one vow, don't go near a corpse. Then he marries. That's not Samson, but you. I had a really hard time finding a picture of Samson at his wedding. So this is just some medieval guy holding up some, grape juice, whatever it is. But he gets married, and what does he have? He has this great party with his buddies. He's drinking his wine. Then finally, he has his haircut. He tells Delilah, if you cut my hair, I will be weak. That's the 3rd strike. Once he breaks that 3rd vow, then he is basically reneged on all of his vows. And therefore God leaves him. Does that help to explain a little bit more about Samson? Okay, this is why God leaves him. And then finally, he kills himself in order to kill all the Philistines. And you know the rest of the story. I'm giving too much away. So come back in January. We'll talk more about it. All right. So it's interesting, though, because the Nazirite vow gives the other tribes an opportunity to consecrate themselves to God, even though the other tribes have lost the priesthood. So it kind of helps to explain the flow here. All right. And then finally, the end of the chapter, we have this great priestly benediction, this great priestly blessing, the Aaronic blessing. Chapter 6, verse 24. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. It's succinct, but it's powerful. One of the things I want to point out here really quickly, the Lord make his face shine upon you. If you go back to Exodus, there's only one individual who saw God face to face. Moses, right? So this blessing is like, may you have this great intimacy with God. May his face shine upon you. And may you love him, may you serve him, and everything that comes with it. Peace and joy, and so on and so forth. All right, it's a very powerful blessing. And fathers can even bless their children with it. So I can bless my daughter and say this very short, very powerful blessing that, God would shine his face upon her. What greater blessing is there than that? Okay, so it's not just restricted to the Levitical priest at this point, because through our baptism, we all share in the priesthood of Christ. So you could bless your family the same way. Okay, so moving on then, chapters 7 through 9, we basically see that All the laid tribes make offerings to the Levites. They're consecrated to God. And then finally in chapter 9, a year later, they celebrate Passover again. So they celebrated Passover when they left Egypt, sort of to begin, they've got their new beginning on their way to Sinai. But now that they've sinned, now that they've had to renew the covenant, they have to celebrate Passover one more time to kind of rededicate themselves to God, to remember God's blessings, to remember how God delivered them out of Egypt, and then off they go. They get ready to leave, and that's what they do. They leave Sinai finally after 1 year, and the Passover kicks it off. Okay? So now here we are at chapter 11. We're beginning the actual march north. So again, here's our map. Mount Sinai, they're beginning to march north. Okay? Everyone with me so far? Yes?
What distance is that?
Well, what's interesting, this right here, I'm not exactly sure. I don't remember. But Moses says in Deuteronomy, it's only 11 days to take this route. Now, we're going to see why it takes 40 years. Okay, we'll see why it takes 40 years. I've got a joke, but I'm saving the joke for later, okay? All right, so I think you probably might have already heard the joke, but just pretend like you haven't, all right? So, Mount Sinai, here they are getting ready to march north. They leave, not 3 days goes by. 3 days. And they start whining and complaining and moaning and so on and so forth. All right? So here we are, chapter 11. Chapter 11, verse 1, they complain. This is a very quick, brief one. They complain about their misfortunes, and then God strikes them down. You're going to notice God He is certainly merciful. He is certainly patient. However, He is now calling the Israelites to a higher standard. You compare God's punishment with the Israelites as they were leaving Egypt going down to Sinai, He's much light. He's not as harsh. But now they've established this covenant with them. Now they have no excuse. To whom much is given, much is required. So God's like, we're not dealing with any of this complaining stuff, okay? And we're going to see this over and over again. Then in verse 4, the rabble, that was among them began to have a craving, and they whine. Oh, that we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt for nothing. The cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, onions, and garlic. It's all organic even. And now our strength is dried up, and there's nothing at all but this manna to eat. So they're whining about the manna, and it goes on to explain the manna. Okay, what the manna is. It's like this honey flaky-like substance. And then Moses, he can't deal with it. Poor Moses. I mean, he's an older guy. He's retired, and he's working overtime. And at one point, he's complaining to God, and he says in verse 11, "Why have you dealt ill with your servant? Why have I not found favor in your sight, that you lay the burden of this people upon me? Did I conceive all this people? Did I bring them forth?" And so on and so forth. Finally, in verse 15, he says, "If you will deal thus with me, kill me at once. If I find favor in your sight, that I might not see my wretchedness." He's like, "I'd prefer to die, God. Just kill me right here, right now. I can't deal with these people." Okay? This is quite humorous. You're going to imagine this. It's quite funny. Okay? And then God says, "Look, I'm going to give my spirit. Pick 70 elders. Pick 70 elders. I will send my spirit upon them, and they will help you deal with the people." Towards the end of chapter 11, what happens for all the people that are gluttonous, taking all the meat, the quails, God strikes them down with a plague. Every time you see God punish them with a plague, it should remind you of Egypt. All right? They're behaving, they're hardening their hearts like the Egyptians did. And so they are basically rebelling against Him, and they will be punished like the Egyptians were. All right, so the complaining right away, not 3 days goes by. That was pretty bad. But not only that, you get to chapter 12, and you find out that his own family begins to rebel against him. Miriam, his sister, the same sister who saved him out of the river, and his brother Aaron. Chapter 12, verse 1, it says, "Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he had married." For he married this Cushite woman, presumably this like Ethiopian woman, an African. "Has the Lord indeed spoken through Moses? Has He not also spoken through us?" So it's very hard to understand what's happening. Dr. Hahn proposes a theory. I'll share it with you. It's basically this. They are being racist. So Moses marries this black woman, and they say, "Why are you marrying this black woman?" Presumably saying, "We should have married an Israelite." But remember, he was a fugitive from Egypt for 40 years at that point. And not only that, but they have this spiritual envy. They are prophets, all right? Moses, or Aaron certainly, right? God speaks to Aaron. But God also spoke to Miriam after they left the Red Sea in Exodus 15. Miriam sings this beautiful song praising God. But there's a distinction. Here in verse 6, God says, "Hear my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, make myself known to him in a vision, and I speak with him in a dream. But not so with my servant Moses. He's entrusted with all of my house." That's the same language as Joseph being entrusted with all of Pharaoh's house. There's no one greater than Moses in this case. "With him I speak mouth to mouth, clearly, not in dark speech, and he beholds the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses?" So what happens? They are spiritually envious, they challenge his authority, and presumably there's this, I don't know, it's weird, maybe this racism thing. So what happens? Boom, Miriam is struck with leprosy. She's just deadly white. She's as if one dead. And this is what's interesting. What, you don't like black skin? May you be white as snow. May you be white as snow. It's an interesting thought, huh? You just have to play with that, think about that. But certainly they're challenging his authority. Takes her 7 days. Moses intercedes with God. And God listens to Moses, and after 7 days of being purified, she's allowed back into the congregation. All right. So we got to move on. There's a lot more stuff going on. But again, this spirit, the rebellion, the disobedience takes place time and time again. Chapter 13. Everyone with me so far? The spies. All right. The spies are sent into Canaan. They're incognito. All right. Well, that's not a bad little... the back pew. If you know the back pew, it's a nice comic strip. Pretty cool. All right. They didn't have sunglasses back then, but it's pretty cute. So the spies are sent into Canaan. Where they are is in Kadesh. Did I put a... I did not. Put a map. I'm sorry. I meant to do that. But they're in Kadesh, which is just north. It was, if you remember on the map, it makes this loop. It's Kadesh right there. That's where they are. And they send the spies into Canaan. So this is what chapters 13 and 14 discuss. One spy from each tribe, except for Levi, because they're set apart for liturgical worship. So 12 spies go in incognito, and what do they find? They find that indeed the land is a very fruitful land. There's that one point right here, chapter 13, verse 23. They came into the valley of Eshcol, and they cut down from there a branch with a single cluster of grapes. And they carried it on a pole between the two of them, and they brought also some pomegranates and figs. A single cluster of grapes on a pole. That's how fruitful the land was. All right, that's how much God has blessed the land. This is why everyone for all time has always fought over this land. There are, of course, more arid regions than others, but they go in, they spy it out, great fruitful land. Okay? And then when they come back, and what do they tell all the people? Verse 27, "We came to the land which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey, and this is the fruit." I was like, wow, imagine the wine, this vintage, you know. "Yet the people who dwell in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there." So these are the great giants. We saw these giants there. So presumably 7 feet tall. I mean, we're not talking like monstrous. We're talking 6.5, 7 feet tall, something like that. Something obviously much more believable, much more reasonable, and that's what's going on. So they say, we can't do it. We can't take the land. But Caleb and Joshua, they say, no, let's go up and occupy it at once. We can do it. They trust God. And then they respond again in verse 31. We're not able to go up against the people. They're stronger than we are. So verse 32, they brought an evil report to the sons of Israel. They brought an evil report of the land which they had spied out, saying, the land through which we have gone out to spy out is a land that devours its inhabitants. And all the people that we saw in it were men of great stature. And there we saw the Nephilim, these sons of Anak. And we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers. All right, so they are... Now, later on, this exaggeration is never found, okay? They're shaking in their boots, okay? They're soiling in their pants. They're just scared. They're not trusting God, okay? Now you continue to read in verse 14, it gets even worse. The congregation yells out, "Would that we have died in Egypt, or would that we had died in this wilderness. Why does the Lord bring us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become a prey. Would it be not better to go back to Egypt?" Forget trusting in God. Forget everything that we've just seen happen to Egypt. I mean, Egypt, Pharaoh and the Egyptians, I mean, they're much greater than these people in the land. And yet they are failing to believe. They're failing to trust. They even go one step further. Chapter 14, verse 4, they want to establish, to choose a captain to lead them back. And it gets even worse. Joshua and Caleb say, "Don't do it. We can take the land." And what do they want to do? They want to stone them. They want to stone Joshua and Caleb. So this is serious rebellion taking place right here. All right? Total lack of trust and unbelief. They are rejecting God's promises. So God says right away, "Let me consume them at once." They've abandoned me again. Let me consume them at once. And Moses has an opportunity to intercede for them. Once more. "No, Lord, remember your covenant." So it's a test for Moses. God knows what he's going to do again. But this is for Moses' sake. And so, again, a pestilence comes. Takes care of a bunch of people. But more importantly, the punishment is this. In chapter 14, verse 28 and following. It summarizes here, 28 to 35. This is just one little verse. "Your little ones, however, you who said would be taken as a spoil, I'm going to bring them in. And they shall know the land that you rejected. But as for you, your body shall fall here in the wilderness." So in other words, you didn't want the land, you want to go back, you'd prefer to die in the wilderness? Fine, have it your way, right away. Like Burger King, right? Have it your way, right away. You're going to die in the wilderness, and you're afraid about your children become a prey. They're not going to be a prey, they're going to take the land. So God says, all right, for every day that the spies were in there, 40 days, you will wander for 40 years. So, here's my joke. It's not that Moses was lost, okay? After 39 years of wandering in the desert, Mrs. Moses secretly asks for directions. It's a very common joke, all right? Mrs. Moses is a Zipporah, by the way. "This way, follow me." They're just wandering out there, just typical man joke, right? Didn't ask for directions. Now I think you can better understand why they're out there for 40 years. They're being punished. They rebelled against God. So they're going to die out in the wilderness, and their children will go back in. All right? You with me so far? All right. It's kind of depressing. Numbers and Deuteronomy is not the best reading for entertainment. But as I said, some elements are quite funny if you imagine it in your head. So, moving on then. That's all 13 and 14. Chapter 16, there's another great rebellion. Surprise, surprise. This time it's Korah, Dathan, Abiram, and On, or On, okay? And they're revolting, and what do they say to Moses? "You've gone too far," they say. Verse 3, "For all the congregation are holy, all of them, and the Lord is among them. Why do you exalt yourselves above the assembly of the Lord?" You begin to read what they want. They want the priesthood. Now, Korah is a Levite. He's an assistant. He's sort of like a deacon. But the other men are not. So what they want is the priesthood. They've lost the priesthood way back in Exodus 32. Now they want it back. Now they're rebelling against Moses and Aaron and the priesthood. Jump down to verse 12. "We will not come up. Is it a small thing that you have brought us out of a land flowing with milk and honey?" Stop. Time out. What did he just say? Did I read that right? "You brought us out of a land flowing with milk and honey." What land is he talking about? Are they talking about? Egypt. They're saying Egypt is the land flowing with milk and honey. And he goes on, "You brought us out of Egypt to kill us in the wilderness so you could make yourself a prince over us. Moreover, you have not brought us into a land flowing with milk and honey, nor given us inheritance in the fields and vineyards. Will you put out the eyes of this man? We will not come up." This is major, ladies and gentlemen. This is priest envy. Again, it's spiritual envy. It's rebellion not only against Moses and Aaron and the priesthood, but against God. We're all priests, not just the consecrated ones. Okay? They can imagine this is very, very bad. So, what happens is there's a showdown, there's another smackdown, to use a contemporary slang. There's a smackdown, and God says, listen, we'll let God decide, all right, who he's blessing. And he says, if something new happens in verse 30, if God creates something new and the ground opens up his mouth and swallows them up with all that they belong, and they go down alive into Sheol, which is the realm of the dead, then you'll know that these men have despised the Lord. And that's exactly what happened. You keep reading verse 31. The earth opens up and swallows them up whole. Just devours them, to prove to the people that the priesthood of Aaron, the Levitical priesthood, is the priesthood established by Christ. And they should just be content where they are. And so this happens, okay? And you would think the people would learn a lesson, right? But do they learn a lesson? No. Good answer. They don't. The very next day, it says in verse 41, the next day, it's like, oh my goodness, give me a scotch. I can't read numbers anymore. The whole congregation murmured and said, you've killed the people of the Lord. They're siding. After seeing this take place, they're siding with the rebellion. And this great plague takes place, and actually Aaron has to intercede, and 14,700 of them die. Another plague is sent. This is major, hard-hearted rebellion. Maybe we should have brought some scotch. Okay, it's hard to read, but we're going to talk what St. Paul says about it for our own sake at the end. Immediately after this, chapter 17, God sort of settles the issue once and for all. Moses commands that one elder from every tribe come out, including Aaron, and they're going to see in verse 5, the rod of the man whom I choose shall sprout, and I will make to cease from me all the murmurings of the sons of Israel. So you got this, again, another showdown, another test. You got all the elders, one elder from the tribes, and Aaron. Whose rod's going to sprout? Aaron's, absolutely. Got a lot of participation from that side, not so much from this side, so you can work on that. All right. So the rod, Aaron's rod finally sprouts. And this is a sign against the rebels. Verse 10 and 11. Keep this rod. And where did they put the rod that sprouted? In the Ark of the Covenant, along with the manna and along with the 10 Commandments. Proving that the covenant that God makes with the Levites is established forever. All right? And then you keep reading chapters 18 and following, 18 and 19, more about the Levitical priesthood. Okay, we got to move on now, all right? The waters of Meribah, chapter 20. This is really interesting because this is where Moses and Aaron get in trouble. So you might have, when I said only 2 people made it to the promised land, it's not Moses and Aaron. It's Joshua and Caleb. Because they obeyed, and so they were the only 2 that were able to enter the land. We read in chapter 20 what Moses and Aaron did wrong to get slapped on the hand and saying, well, you're going to die in the wilderness too. Basically, it's very simple. For chapter 20, verse 3 and following, they complain again. Would that we would die in Egypt. We'd die in the wilderness. Oh my gosh, I wish we had cucumbers to eat. And here we are. Okay? And so finally, they're thirsty. And in verse 8, God says to Moses, chapter 20, verse 8, take the rod, assemble the congregation, and go and tell the rock before their eyes to yield its water. Remember we saw last time, after they left Egypt, God told Moses, strike the rock, and water will come forth to nourish and to slate the thirst of the congregation and the cattle and so on and so forth. Strike the rock. That's what we read back in Exodus. This time, God tells Moses, just speak to the rock. That's all you got to do. Just tell the rock, abracadabra, boom, or whatever it was, and the water will come forth. But he doesn't do that. In verse 10 through 11, Moses says, hear now, you rebels. Could you imagine like a homily starting off like that? A lot of people would probably leave. Shall we, meaning Moses and Aaron, shall we bring forth water for you out of this rock? And he struck the rock twice. He struck the rock twice. He disobeyed God. And so what God says in verse 12, because you did not believe in me to sanctify me in the eyes of the sons of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly or this church. That's a very accurate translation, this church, into the land which I have given them. So very simply, there's a lot going on behind this. There's a lot of sacramental images going on. But basically, the text itself says, you did not believe in me, or you didn't have confidence in me. It seems like Moses' faith is wavering at this point, which is strange. You know, you'd think Moses would believe at this point, but he doesn't. He strikes the rod twice. And water comes forth, of course, but now he's punished. He and Aaron. And another way to understand it is what they're doing is they're trying to establish their own authority. Shall we do this for you? And boom. So it's almost as if they are the ones providing it, and they're not relying on God to provide Israel with all the water from the rock. So there's a couple of things going on here. And so, of course, they're punished, and they're not able to do it. Okay? Miriam dies in this chapter at the beginning of the chapter, and Aaron dies at the end of the chapter. All right, so Aaron dies almost right away. And at this point, Miriam is already dead. So this is very, very bad for the leaders of Israel. All right, and the other thing I want to point out is, to whom much is given, much is required. This is also Moses, the leader of the people, who made a bad mistake, so God will punish him for it. He's not going to hell, of course, but temporally speaking, a temporal punishment, a penance of his that he's going to have to endure is not going to the land. He'll see the land, but he can't go into it. Are you with me? All this takes place here in this area. They're moving on to, finally, they leave Kadesh, right here in this area, as I pointed out. There's my map. And they're moving finally towards the north, and there's this bronze serpent. Very, very simply, in verse 21, they complain again. Surprise, surprise. They're complaining, why have you brought us out? There's no food, there's water. We hate this worthless food. The manna, this worthless food. And then God sends serpents to go and bite them and kill them. Okay? Moses intercedes, and the response to the serpent, or the response to the plague of serpents, I should say, is a bronze serpent. Put it on this tree. Put it on, you can see it's almost like a cross. Mounted on a pole, whoever is bitten and looks at this golden serpent here, this bronze serpent, pardon me, and they believe they will be saved. All you got to do is gaze upon this bronze serpent on the pole to be saved. And in fact, Jesus himself refers to this instance and says, just like the serpent was lifted on a pole for them to be saved in John chapter 3, verse 14, so too will the Son of Man be lifted up. This is a type of Christ right here. Sort of like the source of death. Death itself is going to save us. And that's very ironic to think about that. The crucifixion of Christ, when he's lifted up on the pole, will be the source of our salvation for those who believe and obey him. All right, that's pretty cool. I didn't want to skip over that, even though I'm kind of going over it quickly. That's really cool. You know, look upon and gaze upon the death of Christ, because it will bring us salvation. Okay. Now, finally, we got two more big points to talk about. After all this time, they get up here. They finally made it to the promised land. This is the second generation now. Generation number 2, 40 years have gone by. We're in chapter 22 of Numbers. 40 years goes by. They're at the plains of Moab. They're getting ready to cross over. The king of Moab is scared. He knows that you cannot defeat the Israelites by sword. How is he going to defeat the Israelites? Or at least try? Spiritually. So he sends off a telegram. He tweets this guy up north, Balaam. So Balak is the king's name. He sends an email off to Balaam saying, hey, I want you to come down and curse these people. That's the only way I'm going to win. Curse these people. So long story short, he does come down. I have to skip over a couple of different things. You can read it. This is when his donkey famously speaks to him. All right, you remember that story? Got a couple, so tempted. Okay, I'm going to give in. All right, so it's good stuff. All right, it's good stuff. So Balaam is riding his donkey. We're in chapter 22, verse 21 and following. And the angel of the Lord is standing in the way to kill him. So it's very hard to understand, but this is the basic story. And I don't pretend to understand it entirely myself. It's really interesting. So he does go down to, he got paid a great price to curse Israel. The angel of the Lord is standing in the way, and the donkey sees the angel and stops and won't move, or it goes out of the way. This happens 3 times. Balaam's getting extremely frustrated at this point. The 3rd time, the donkey doesn't move at all. And then he starts beating the donkey with this rod, just striking the donkey over and over again. And in verse 28, the donkey talks. This donkey speaks to him. And that's as if that wasn't strange enough, he talks back to the donkey. All right? Verse 28, the donkey says, well, what have I done to you that you've struck me these 3 times? And Balaam said, well, because you made sport of me. And I wish I had a sword so I could kill you. And the donkey said, am I not your donkey? All right? Upon which you have ridden all your life to this day. Was I ever accustomed to do this to you? What does he say? Sheepishly, no, you're right. You're right. You've been a good donkey to me. And then the Lord opens up his eyes and he sees the angel of the Lord, okay? So this happens. He finally goes down and he cannot help but to bless Israel. God tells him, just speak whatever I say to you. And Balaam says to the king of Moab, must I not speak what the Lord puts into my mouth? He tries 4 times to curse Israel. Every time he opens up his mouth, I bless you, instead of cursing him. I bless you. And the blessings are amazing. You can go back and look at them from chapter 23 to 24. But the 4th blessing is extremely interesting because it's a prophecy of the Messiah. Chapter 24, verses 17 and 18. Balaam speaks out and he says, I see him, though not now. So it's going to be a ways now, far in the future. I observe him, though not near. A star shall advance from Jacob, and a scepter shall rise from his hand. A star shall arise, and a scepter. He's going to be a king. That will crush the brows of Moab and the skull of the Sethites. Edom will be dispossessed. So when is this prophecy fulfilled? With Jesus, at what point? When he was born, the star rises up out of Jacob, and the king is born. Something very interesting, Herod starts to freak out. And we know the story, he kills all the male children 2 years and older. But it said this prophecy is that Edom will be dispossessed. Herod is an Edomite. That's why he really begins to panic. He wants to be the king of Israel, but this prophecy says there will be another king, the true king, that will come and dispossess Edom. So that's when Herod rushes out to try to kill all the male children. Help to explain things a bit? Besides the fact that he's a psychomaniac, but there is a method to his madness there. Okay, so Balaam, though, at this point, he can't curse Israel. So what does he decide to do instead? He tells the king, I can't curse them, but what you can do is lead them into sin. Why don't you send out all your good-looking women, your cultic prostitutes, and get them to fall into sin? And that's what he does. And they do fall into sin. This is the 2nd generation. So chapter 25, verses 1 and 3. They fall into idolatry. Israel was living at Shittim. The people profaned themselves by prostituting themselves with the Moabite women. These then invited the people to the sacrifices of their god, Baal, and the people ate of the sacrifices and bowed down to their god. And Israel thereby attached itself to the Baal of Peor, and the Lord's anger flared up against Israel. This is another golden calf incident, ladies and gentlemen. You would think that the 2nd generation would learn from their parents, right? Right? But do children often learn from their parents' mistakes? No, they don't. They make the same mistakes, okay? And this is what happens. They fall the same cultic prostitution, eating with them. It's sort of like they are establishing a communion with the false gods. It's like this deep sigh. What are you guys doing? Another scotch, please. All right. So, what the calf was to the 1st generation, so Beth Peor is to the 2nd generation. All right. They're falling into all this sin. And what's interesting, what's even worse, if you drop down to verse 6 and 7 and following, one guy brought a Midianite woman to his family in the sight of all the people. And he goes to the tent of meeting. What's the tent of meeting? The tabernacle. He brings this cultic prostitute into the inner tent. And everybody's crying. Moses is crying. Oh my gosh, what are they doing? What are we going to do about it? But only one guy gets up and does something about it. Phinehas, verse 7. The son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest. He saw it. He left the congregation, took a spear, and went into the inner room where they were and stabbed the both of them together. Right into the floor. Pierced the both of them right into the floor. And Moses, oh my gosh, what are you doing, Phinehas? He says, no. Phinehas merits the high priesthood as a perpetual covenant. So just like the Levites rose up against the idolaters at the golden calf and merited for themselves the priesthood, now Phinehas merits for himself the high priesthood. His line will be the high priest forever because he was zealous for the Lord, because of this awful sin that they were doing. Okay? 24,000 people die in this plague. Just the people who fell into the idolatry. They die, and we got to start all over again. They're at the plains of Moab, right there across the Jordan River. Okay? Moses intercedes. God forgives them. A new census is taken. So the second census, the second numbers, takes place right here. And that's why 24,000 people die. They got to start all over again. All right, there are 40, we find out in chapter 33, in the 40 years that they wandered in the desert, they stopped at 40 different places. And 40 is a sign of a number of trial, of testing, of purification, and they failed the test. So Moses' last words before he dies, right after this incident, is what the book of Deuteronomy is all about. It's his last will and testament before they go in. So I want to spend one more minute, maybe 2 more minutes, then we got to take a break. We went a little longer, but you can see, that's not too bad for the whole book of Numbers. St. Paul talks in detail about all of the wanderings in the desert, but I just got this one verse here to sort of highlight his main point. St. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10:11, all of these things happened to them as an example, and they have been written down as a warning to us, upon whom the end of the ages has come. Meaning we're living in the age of the Messiah. Jesus has come. We're living in the age of the promise. So look back at Numbers and look at everything that's just happened to them and let it be as a warning to you. Don't harden your hearts. Don't rebel. Don't grumble, and so on and so forth. He actually says don't take the Eucharist unworthily. That's the context. Don't take the Eucharist unworthily because some of you are suffering, you're sick, and you're dying. This is a strong word. So Numbers is an example to us Christians living in this time. I would love to say more, but it's time to recharge our batteries, right? So go meet 2 new people, drink coffee, do stupid things faster with more energy. Okay? And we'll come back after a 10-minute break, all right?